Hi, I'm Jay Allen Sanford from the San Diego Reader, and we're here to talk again about another episode of the 1950s TV anthology Tales of Tomorrow. I've written about this show and other shows like it for magazines like Starlog and FilmFax, Midnight Marquee, and it was actually the San Diego Reader that published the in-depth history of this program a while back that resulted in this DVD set. The article actually was started back in 1989, and I interviewed several of the show's creators and performers, and I'll read you some of those quotes over the course of some of these DVD commentaries. Our intro scene here, we're going to be watching tonight an episode called Test Flight, and since the engineers have the sound turned down, I'll tell you what the opening narration says. The narrator announces if money was no object and a man was determined to build an interplanetary spaceship, what would happen? And that is the premise of our story tonight. The story for Test Flight actually bears a lot of similarities to a couple of others you might be familiar with. There's one called The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert Heinlein, and that was actually published just about a year previous to this appearing on television, 1950. And in that story, it's about a rich man he's obsessed with finding, or rather becoming the first man to reach the moon, no matter what, because he thinks that the resources there are going to make him rich, and no matter what it costs, he wants to be the guy to be the first one there. The story also shares a lot in common with, if you see the movie Destination Moon, which also came out in 1950. That's actually about a bunch of wealthy visionaries in America who kind of pool their resources together, financially and tech-wise, in order to enable the United States to be the first on the moon. And when you think about it, this really does interestingly presage what's happening now in 2022. As I record this commentary, we have billionaires that are financing their own trips into space, a couple of them in particular, and not at all unlike the premise of our story here. Uh, Tales of Tomorrow, I'll tell you a little bit about. It ran actually year-round, just about, on ABC. It started in August 1951, ran all the way through June 1953. There were 2 seasons altogether. There was 85 half-hour episodes. They shot this at ABC's Studio One. That was in New York City. And they'd start rehearsals generally on a Monday, and they'd perform it live for the cameras on Friday night at 9:30. At the same time as it was broadcast, the reason we can watch these episodes now is because producers would shoot what are called kinescopes. These were intended for the unhooked up stations and the ones that played in different time zones across the country. And the kinescope process is basically pointing an Eastman recording camera at a television set as the show airs, and you film it for later broadcasts. And although Tales of Tomorrow, sometimes people do call it television's first sci-fi anthology. Of course, there were other sci-fi anthologies on TV, at least anthologies that dealt in sci-fi from time to time. And this show itself, would cover a lot of different genres itself. It wasn't always sci-fi. There was doomsday stories, there were mad scientist stories, alternate realities, time travel stories, and we're kind of basically in a space opera this week. Actually, we're mixing space opera and mad scientists, you could say. This was actually the 10th episode of the series, Test Flight, and well, again, this guy could be like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. What we've got is here, the time when I should tell you a little bit about what's happening in the world. When this aired in October 1951, the Viking rocket was actually, it just scored a world record. It had reached over, I think, 130 miles high. And people that were going to the movies were seeing movies like The Thing from Another World, The Day the Earth Stood Still. And this story here actually is based on one by Nelson Bond. It was originally called Vital Factor, and it ran in the August 1951 issue of Esquire magazine. And if you're counting up on your fingers, yeah, that's just a few months before this aired on TV. So they wasted no time, the producers, in picking the story up and adapting it for television. The same story actually was also adapted for a low-budget radio show produced by a rival network, this being an ABC show. Well, an NBC had a radio show called Dimension X, and that was broadcast pretty much at the same time the story was published. It was the August 16th, 1951 episode. So right about when you could buy this story on the stands, it was on the radio, and a few months later you could see this Tales of Tomorrow version. Our version that we're watching aired on October 26th, 1951. It was at 9:30 p.m., unless you were, of course, on the West Coast, in which case you got to watch the kinescope. on Friday, November 9th, 1951. So our star is Lee J. Cobb, and as we talked about, a very wealthy and, as it turns out, very ruthless businessman. He's building his own spaceship, but it's not out of allegiance to his country, but rather because he wants to become wealthy. He thinks that that there's going to be resources on the moon, and that by being the first guy up there, or rather to Mars, that he's going to basically take over the world. And he's spending all of his corporation's money on it without getting their permission ahead of time, as it turns out. That figure is bandied about different numbers different times. Near the beginning here, he calls it well over 500 million, and later on ends up going over a billion at one point. And but what he's doing, he wants to go to Mars because he thinks that this will make him the richest man in the world. At one point he says, I think the quote is, more wealth, more minerals, more than anyone has ever dreamed up there. And his company is called Crowder Enterprises. And another quote I wrote down as I was watching this, he wrote, Crowder Enterprises controlling not just one world, but all worlds. So this guy basically wants to conquer the entire universe. He's kind of Emperor Ming in a business suit here. Well, greedy people getting their just desserts is actually a fairly common thing on Tales of Tomorrow. We've got a little aside here going. We've got a bunch of this really cheesy stock footage that fills up about a minute and a half of our program here. It's basically just pulled. Some of it seems to have no bearing on the story whatsoever, but that was fairly common on Tales of Tomorrow too. But yeah, greedy people who get their comeuppance. That's something that Rod Serling, of course, was really fond of exploring. The program Boris Karloff's Thriller did that quite a bit. In fact, mentioning Boris Karloff, he did an episode of Tales of Tomorrow called Past Tense, where he plays a scientist who he brings modern life-saving medicine back to the world of I think it's 1910. But he doesn't do it to save lives. He does it because he thinks he can sell the penicillin at an enormous profit, which of course he gets exactly what he deserves for that sort of thing. So in this episode we're watching, Lee J. Cobb plays an industrialist. He's not really a scientist, and he's certainly more about increasing his bank account than doing anything good for science. The fellow who plays our industrialist, Lee J. Cobb, he wasn't a big star in 1951, but he wasn't exactly unknown. At this point, he was fairly well known on Broadway. He got a lot of press in the late 40s, of course, playing the lead in Death of a Salesman. It would probably be another half dozen years or so before you call him a household name and he'd be a genuine movie star. And that would have been in 1957 when he ends up doing 12 Angry Men. So now, although sound is turned down here, I should note that much of the first act I discovered of this episode is basically improvised by Lee J. Cobb. And once you realize that, it's kind of easy to tell. He flubs his lines, and he doesn't really seem to have a cogent train of thought going. When I interviewed one of the program sponsors, a fellow named Robert Lewin, he actually read me this quote that I will read to you. He said, when the curtain went up, so to speak, and the lights came on, he, referring to Lee J. Cobb, got the cue to start, and he was by himself at his desk, and he could not think of the lines. He went blank. We lost the first 2 pages of the script, unquote. So I've never actually seen the script for this. I'm not sure what we lost, but he kind of rambles on about some incredibly unscientific stuff about apogees and stratospheres that makes no sense whatsoever. And I'm fairly sure that's a large chunk of that is the improvised section that Robert Lewin was talking about. Not that Lee J. Cobb does a terrible job here. He pulls it together better for Act 2. But actually, if you look really closely, in Act 2, after the wardrobe changes, you can actually see when he puts on his spacesuit, if you look real closely, you still see his necktie, his actual business suit on underneath. So I guess he didn't have time to go change before he was ready to go up in space. Lots of flubs turn up on Tales of Tomorrow. I mean, this was a low-budget TV show, and it was taped live, filmed live rather, and broadcast live on the East Coast, so flubs were fairly common. I remember there's one called Appointment from Mars, where you can actually see the studio lighting rigs at the edge of the set. It's like a Martian set backdrop. And that same episode actually is a fight scene between 2 of the astronauts, and it was originally supposed to end in gunplay, but one of the actors dropped his gun before they got to that point, and so the entire final act of that one is an improvised fist fight that almost miraculously ended right on cue, since these things are timed fairly shortly. fairly closely. So we should talk a bit about the writer of this because he did turn up fairly often on Tales of Tomorrow. It was adapted by a fellow named Mel Goldberg, and he later wrote for shows like Hang 'em High, The Big Valley, Hawaii Five-0. After Tales of Tomorrow, he wrote for other anthology shows like Suspense, probably one of the best knowns. Wrote for a lesser one known called The Mask in 1954. He wrote for the real big TV anthologies like Studio One, Climax, Kraft Theater, General Electric Theater. In 1960, he wrote a very good episode of Boris Karloff's thriller you may be familiar with called Worse Than Murder, which is the one about a woman, she uses a diary for blackmail. And if you remember the 1974 anthology TV show The Evil Touch, which didn't have a whole lot of good episodes, there really was a decent one that he scripted that was called Death by Dreaming. He retired a few years after writing the 1978 Lost Island episode of The $6 Million Man, which I only vaguely remember, but I remember that being one of the few that I like. So Mel wrote another Tales of Tomorrow episode that accurately predicts this sort of 21st century reality that we're living now. He wrote one called Sneak Attack, which is basically about drones, armed drones that show up all over America and they start exploding. It's part of an invasion attempt by this sort of Russian-style enemy. But that also presages modern warfare in startling ways, also scripted by Mel Goldberg. And that episode was broadcast on the 10th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack in 1951. So Mel Goldberg wrote in total 8 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow, besides Test Flight and Sneak Attack that I mentioned. He also scripted Bound Together, The Children's Room, and one called The Enemy Unknown. And he worked with the same director as he did on this one, a fellow named Charles Dubin, on an episode called The Search for the Flying Saucer. And that one starred, it's like kind of a comedic one starring comic actor Jack Carter. Dubin and Goldberg also worked together on the H.G. Wells story that Tales of Tomorrow did, The Crystal Egg. And that's actually one of the most genuinely terrifying episodes of this series. That has Oscar winner Thomas Mitchell as a professor who he basically looks into an interstellar abyss, only to find something in that abyss is looking back at him. So that's the same team that we have here with Mel Goldberg and Charles S. Dubin. Charles directed, they did What You Need together. I should probably mention that real briefly. That was in 1952, and that was based on a story that was in a 1945 issue of Astounding that you may remember was adapted for the Twilight Zone. It's the one about the shop owner who has a fortune-telling machine that gives customers exactly what they need just before something momentous happens. And I think Twilight Zone kind of shuffled it so that he's like a vendor, a cart-carrying vendor. But it is the same basic story that Charles Dubin and Mel Goldberg did for Tales of Tomorrow, What You Need. Dubin also directed the Dark Angel episode of Tales of Tomorrow, which is one of the many where women are portrayed as at best not to be trusted and at worst like capable of bringing about the end of the world. We've talked in other commentaries about how on Tales of Tomorrow they seem to really have an obsession with portraying any independent woman or a woman with an independent streak as being downright dangerous. It's actually no coincidence they took a famous short story with a small boy called A Child Is Crying, and they changed the gender of that to a little girl when they did the Tales of Tomorrow version. So Charles S. Dubin would go on to direct anthologies like Omnibus. He did westerns like Big Valley, The Virginian. Did a lot of standard primetime TV shows like Hawaii Five-0, Kojak, Lou Grant. I think he did an episode of Tarzan. And I saw he did a series called Super Train, if you remember that one from '79. I mean, the thing he was probably best known for is 44 episodes of MASH. He was on that for quite a while, and he did several episodes of a show that we should probably mention because the pilot was written by Rod Serling. It was called The New People in the late '60s. I think Rod only wrote the pilot, but it was a pretty wild premise. It's a bunch of teenagers, diverse teenagers, all different races and backgrounds, who get stranded on a deserted island. And the island's basically fully stocked because there was going to be some nuclear tests, but they ended up not blowing up the island. So they've got all these supplies, and they have to form a new society, basically, these teenagers, a kind of hippie commune. And Charles S. Dubin wrote a bunch of those, and I kind of would like to see those. They're very hard to find. Only a couple are on YouTube, and none of his. I see on his filmography, he wrote one called "The Pied Piper of Pots," and I would be very curious to see that. So, now, back to our episode here. We have another actor we should talk about. The fellow who accompanies Lee J. Cobb, brings him the mysterious tech he needs to finish this spaceship. He's played by Harry Towns, who was also turned up fairly often on Boris Karloff's Thriller. And in this show, they call him the first man to conquer space. At least that's his ambitions, anyways. And he brings basically an engine that they call the power source counter-gravity. And it's fairly ridiculous, but in the context of the story, it enables space travel. And even though he's this really meek guy and he bleeds Cobb of all of his money to pull this off, he turned out to be, well, I assume you've seen this before you listen to the commentary, but we'll go ahead and save that spoiler until we get to a point where we're ready for the spoiler alert. So Harry Towns, he also appears in a Tales of Tomorrow episode called Youth on Tap. That ran probably about a year from now in September 1952. And that was actually, well, fans of Boris Karloff's Thriller are really going to remember him from that show. And Star Trek people also are going to remember him from the Return of the Archons episode. I'm looking over his filmography here, and holy cow, you got Perry Mason, Gunsmoke, The Fugitive, Bonanza, Mannix, and I'd forgotten actually he played the original Hulk. I guess they call him the first Hulk in the old Lou Ferrigno series. It's a 2-part episode. A few years after Tales of Tomorrow here in 1959, he of course appeared on the Twilight Zone episode The Four of Us Are Dying. Now here his character is presented as this mysterious enigma. One guy says, well, the man's he's a scientist and an engineer, and he's like some kind of genius. Like you can't be a scientist and an engineer. But shadowy geniuses who drop advanced tech into these stories were another one of those Tales of Tomorrow staples. We've done several commentaries on similar stories. Seeing Eye Surgeon is one. It's about a mysterious stranger named Xenon who brings his doctor, played by Bruce Cabot from King Kong, this high-tech futuristic pair of eyeglasses that he uses to perform brain surgery on an important physicist. Our same director from this one, Charles S. Dubin, he directed a similar premise with mystery tech it's called The Little Black Bag, a doctor's medical kit from the future. Central to that story, and that was also adapted for Rod Serling's Night Gallery. You might remember that. I think it was Burgess Meredith was in that. The original story, of course, was a 1952 story by C.M. Kornbluth. It was also adapted, it just occurred to me, for a British show called Out of the Unknown. I'm not sure what year that was, but that was a real popular story. In Tales of Tomorrow, there's another guy that shows up with strange tech in Flight Overdue. And that actually stars movie star Veronica Lake. She's kind of an Amelia Earhart type airplane pilot, and her mysterious disappearance appears to be tied to this strange man who showed up and provided her what she needs to... well, you might not have seen that one, so we won't do any spoiler alerts there, other than mentioning that her husband does not like the fact that she keeps disappearing with this mysterious stranger with a strange otherworldly tech. So in test flight, our mysterious high-tech bearing stranger turns out to be, and I guess we're about to find out here, so we can go ahead and reveal, presuming you've watched this. He's much like David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth. He's actually a Martian, and he did all this because he's really just trying to get back home to Mars. And this whole test flight, which actually is no longer a test flight, it turns out. Once they're actually up in space here, it turns out this is actually the flight because well, he's not really a villain. He just really wants to go home. But yeah, he did spend this guy's money, and he bankrupted his corporation. And I think he depleted the world supply of several vital resources that were necessary to build this ship, which we see now taking off. And but really, again, like David Bowie and The Man Who Fell to Earth, he just wanted to go home. And at this point, of course, we know that something's up with the guy. And we love this little stock footage that we see here again. It fills out at least another minute or so of our storyline. And really, I mean, when you look at the set there, all things considered, I mean, yeah, they probably pulled a bunch of those pieces from Rod Jones of the Rocket Rangers and maybe some Tom Corbett Space Cadet pieces. But they would generally put these, particularly the ones set in space, put them together in a way that was geared towards adults. I mean, it wasn't like most sci-fi on television in the 50s, of course, was geared towards children. And so you would see things like, the ray guns with the big fins, like a 50s car. And you would see view screens that look like a television set, basically. But the thought process that went into designing the sets for a show like Tales of Tomorrow was that kids aren't going to be watching this. For one thing, the ads aren't geared towards kids. The ads are geared towards buying carpets, and there's jewelry designed for women. And the storylines, of course, these are very adult stories and adapted in a fairly straightforward way that emulates the way that they're told in their original incarnations. It was an attempt by what was called the Science Fiction League of America, which was a coalition of authors that pooled their stories and resources to provide the source material for this series. It was a genuine effort to bring America exposure to classic science fiction stories by the likes of Arthur C. Clarke, whose work was in the series. Theodore Sturgeon was one of the actual founders of the series. It was his idea that basically led to the developing of the show. It wasn't geared towards kids at all. It was very much intended for adults. And you see the care that went into a set like this that is, although still silly as far as 50s tech goes, it doesn't look like a kid show. It doesn't look like, someone's going to go out on a spacewalk with a rope holding up his airline. Kind of a fun special effect here where we find out that our Harry Towns really wants to go back home and he's really a Martian. And this little paper mache mask that they superimpose in fairly slowly is fairly effective. And for that matter, old E.J. Cobb's reaction isn't bad at all. I mean, this ain't bad TV. Gotta tell you. So you can't hear because of the engineers turning it down, but this episode had some absolutely crazy over-the-top organ music that probably we're lucky that it was turned down because it would have most likely affected your enjoyment of the episode. It was kind of soap opera stuff turned up extremely loud for some reason and basically wall-to-wall in this episode. We didn't miss much there. Didn't get to talk much about the commercials, but I think we got a pretty good feel for what was going on with this episode, a little bit of information about the people that made it for us. And I guess that wraps it up for another episode of Tales of Tomorrow. I hope you enjoy listening to these, and I hope you enjoy watching these nice prints that they've dug up for this DVD set. It's been a joy doing these, and we've got about 15, 20 more of these coming. So thank you for buying, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest.